Professor Lewis here. I am doing this video just as a supplement because we've had some people who are absent the day these were covered. This is no substitute. I repeat, no substitute for actually having been in class, but I'm doing these as an aid for students, especially because we've had some absences recently. So what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with the fact that we've got macro equilibriums. We have a bunch of them. Sometimes they start in the intermediate segment of AS, sometimes the classical segment of aggregate supply, sometimes the Keynesian segment of aggregate supply. And we're going to be working through the ones that are not highlighted. So I just want to go straight to paint, and this is what we're going to be using for what we're working here. Part C talks about the fact that we're dealing with the interest rate on commercial debt. That's like corporate bonds and business loans dropping. And notice macro equilibrium is in the Keynesian segment. It looks like Keynesian, but it's pronounced Keynes, like raising Cane's chicken fingers, Ian. Keynesian. That is the name of the horizontal segment that includes the CPI sub R. CPI sub R is the starting macro equilibrium CPI, and real GDP sub 1 is the starting real GDP value. Now, the thing is, we have to figure out, does this particular item affect total spending, or does it affect aggregate production costs? And I'm making some notes over here to help us answer this thing here. The interest in commercial debt is a price that businesses pay to borrow money, like corporations or small businesses. And corporations will sell bonds to borrow from financial investors, and businesses that on the smaller level will take out commercial loans and credit cards, and they use it for one thing: to buy finished capital resources. Businesses buying finished capital resources are what we call gross private domestic investment, and they're part of total spending. The question is, if it's cheaper to borrow money, will there be an increase or a decrease in gross private domestic investment spending? Think about that for a moment. If it's cheaper to borrow money, it is cheaper to buy finished capital resources, so therefore this increases. Now, if any part of spending is increasing, first of all, if any part of spending changes, the curve that changes is AD, which stands for aggregate demand. And we don't say increase or decrease with the curve. It's either shift right or shift left. When spending increases, the AD curve shifts to the right. And so we're going to be dealing with that in just a second here. So that's our first piece of information. Now, remember what it says in the directions. Let's take a look at back this here. It says the time frame is between 6 and 9 months. That applies for all these problems we're working. What this means, students, is that there's not going to be a shifting of the macro equilibrium out of the segment of aggregate supply where it began. That's why you'll notice the AD curve is dead smack in the middle of the Keynesian segment. If AD shifts left, there needs to be room for it to shift left. And if it shifts right, there needs to be room for it to shift right, so we can handle this correctly. Now, I need to create a couple of other objects over here because we have to be able to show this. I need to make sure this is blue because we always change our graphs from black to blue. And I also need to get rid of the parts of the stuff I don't need. The AD curve only has a negative slope. And so I don't need any piece that has a positive or a flat or a totally horizontal slope. And so that looks a little bit better. And since we have a starting position already, the new position is going to be labeled AD2, and we're going to label both endpoints for AD. That's kind of part of the convention there. And so I'm going to create this object, and I'm going to have it available if we have any more shifting of the AD curve. And so this is just a little side object I'm going to keep over here. But I'm going to copy it and paste it. I'm going to put it so it's there in that Keynesian segment, but to the right of the original Keynesian segment. And to make the point clear about how this is shifting, I'm going to put a shifter arrow here that is showing, okay, a shift to the right of the Keynesian of the AD curve within the Keynesian segment. Now, I need to locate the new real GDP, which is going to be, as you'll see, to the right of the original GDP. Okay, and then we're going to label that real GDP 2 to distinguish it from real GDP 1 where it started. Now, let's take a look at something else here I want y'all to notice, okay? There is no vertical shift of CPI because there is only one vertical coordinate for a horizontal line, and for this segment called Keynesian, that's CPI sub R, normalized recessionary CPI. Now, but deselect this here. Let me change that color back, and this is being tetchy as usual here. That's fine. I'll put that arrow back in there. We want to see where that change is happening. Okay. I am going to go ahead and finish what we're talking about here. We have to talk about CPI. CPI isn't changing. CPI stays the same. However, you notice real GDP is to the right of the original value. Real GDP is a coordinate. Coordinates increase or decrease. Curves shift left and right. Real GDP is increasing because of this rightward shift of the AD curve in that Keynesian segment. And so this here is the summary information you have to provide, and that's the graph you have to do. Now, again, we are not shifting the AD curve out of the Keynesian segment because the time frame is too short. To shift it out of there, we need to have longer than a year. We'll have that in Unit 3, but for Unit 2, this is first impact, which is the first between 6 and 9 months, long enough for the curve to move, but not so long as to cause the curve to kick out of the segment of the AS curve where it began. So that's the first answer. Now we're moving on to letter F. Letter F is dealing with the healthcare industry, which is about 6% or roughly $1.2 trillion in our GDP, 6% of that, okay? So here's the situation. We have our starting macro equilibrium in the intermediate segment, which slopes upward. CPI 1 is the starting CPI. Real GDP sub 1 is the starting real GDP. And we're told the cost of employing doctors, nurses, orderlies, and lab technicians is increasing in the healthcare industry. The healthcare industry's output is more than 1% of our GDP. And these individuals are what you call skilled labor resources. This is what you would call a very important or a key economic resource. And notice the cost is increasing. People got to pay rent. People got to pay their mortgages and eat, even doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel here. So we say cost of key economic resources, increases. Now, resource costs are not spending. Spending only affects AD. This is a cost of production, an aggregate cost of production. Aggregate meaning economy-wide, not just one industry. And the cost of key resources and the cost of production in the key industry are factors that affect this. Now, you have to be careful about the mechanics of shifting the AS curve here. But the thing is, since the costs are higher, will there be more or less production? If it costs more to employ labor resources, you're going to be employing fewer, and those labor resources are necessary for patient care and for healthcare to be executed. Higher cost of resources leads to less production, so the AS curve, aggregate supply, is shifting to the left. Aggregate supply shifts left. Now, here's the thing about shifting the AS curve left. That Keynesian or horizontal segment does not shift up vertically. That takes 20 years to happen. That's macro long run. We will never deal with macro long run in a survey course. This is macro short run. And so that means that the Keynesian or horizontal segment will get shorter to the left. But the upward sloping intermediate piece will shift left. And the vertical or classical piece will also shift to the left. And so here's how we're going to handle that. First of all, I'm going to see if I can find a free pencil or brush to use here. I'm going to try that. Let me see if it's going to let me draw this thing here. Yeah, that's not too bad. I would much rather use a cleaner curve than that. But the thing is, I'm going to redraw this upward sloping piece for the intermediate segment. Notice I'm starting at a spot that is to the left of the original joining of the intermediate to Keynesian. It has to be noticeably horizontally to the left. And that's not the best drawing. Let me try to do this a little bit cleaner. We have a parallel shift to the left of that intermediate segment, and then a parallel shift to the left of the vertical, which is called classical segment. And so we get this thing constructed, and I'll get it labeled in just a second. The starting position is technically AS1, so the new position is going to be labeled AS2. And so let me get that label in place. Don't forget your labels on at least, it has to be 1 endpoint for aggregate supply, 2 for aggregate demand. And we're going to get an arrow, okay? And the thing is, I want to have that thing filled on the inside. So let me see if I can get this thing to work this way. No, it won't. Well, you know what? Forget about it. I'm not going to sweat it at this point. Yeah, not working. Okay, well, fine, whatever. The AS curve is shifting left. Now, we need to locate our new macro equilibrium. Notice the new macro equilibrium is still in the intermediate segment. It's just in the new position for the intermediate segment. And so that's where we're going to find the vertical coordinate. And then down here is we're going to find the horizontal coordinate. The vertical coordinate is the new CPI. And the horizontal coordinate is the new real GDP. So let me get this stuff in place here. CPI2, real GDP2. And the real doesn't have to be capitalized. I just did that kind of just typing real fast. Let's locate those things where they belong. Okay. Now we want to make sure we pay attention to positions here. Notice the new CPI is vertically above the old one. And notice the new real GDP is horizontally to the left. These coordinates increase or decrease based upon the directionality. And since the new CPI is higher than the old one, that means we have an increase in our CPI for macro equilibrium. And since the new real GDP is to the left of the old one, okay, that means that we have a smaller real GDP. So CPI increases, real GDP decreases is the end result. And let's just move that over there to where it's to the left, to the right of this thing so we can see this here. Now, interesting thing that we're seeing over here is this is what you call a negative production shock. Costs of production across the entire country have gone up. And as a result of that, it's causing a drop in production. Real GDP is smaller, but prices are rising. Now, you should recognize this is something we talked about earlier in Unit 2. What makes prices on the aggregate increase when you have a negative shock to production where costs rise? By the way, when real GDP gets smaller, remember what happens to unemployment? Yeah, unemployment increases when real GDP gets smaller. Higher unemployment, higher prices. That is called cost push inflation. Now, that's not part of the answer. This is the answer the problem is written. But be aware, this graph is showing cost push inflation. All right. Now we're going to letter M. I told you we're jumping around here. Letter M says we're in the classical, which is the vertical segment. Remember real GDP sub F? That's potential GDP. Potential GDP is a level of GDP we associate with the classical segment. It is tied to the peak of the business cycle at the classical segment model. So CPI sub 1, real GDP sub F is where we begin. And so I'm going to need to grab this AD2 and use it in just a second maybe. Oh, actually, you know what? I don't know if it's AD yet. Let's take a look what it says. It says the government is reducing its own spending. Yes, I will need that AD curve. Reason is very simple. Spending only affects aggregate demand. And in fact, this thing was handed to us on a silver platter. We were told government spending is decreasing as part of contractionary fiscal policy. And when spending decreases, the AD curve does what? If you said shifts to the left, you are correct. It's going to shift to the left. When spending decreases, AD shifts to the left, but remember, we're not going to be leaving the segment of AS where we began. We start classical, in 9 months, it'll shift to the left, but it'll still be in that classical segment. So let me get this thing in place. It's not as parallel as I would like it. I would really like these things to be the same size. And when you're drawing this freehand or using your protractor, it's a lot easier to make this stuff more parallel. I'm doing this because it's hard to find a way to do this thing cleanly, okay, on the graphs as is. So what I'm locating now is I'm locating the new CPI, which we will label CPI sub 2. And I'm going to put it over there on the vertical axis where it belongs. And y'all will notice we're definitely seeing a decrease in the CPI. You notice it's vertically going down. But what about real GDP? Is real GDP moving? Well, here's a hint. A vertical line has a fixed horizontal coordinate. And since AD is still crossing that vertical segment of AS, then the answer is no. Okay, we still have the same real GDP called potential. And so we're going to need to take a moment here once the computer catches up, and we need to kind of summarize. CPI decreases. Anybody remember what it's called when the CPI decreases? A drop in overall price levels is known as deflation. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Okay, so GDP, however, real GDP, excuse me, stays the same. Around the peak of the business cycle, that's what the classical segment is modeling. The peak of the business cycle models this here. And as a result of this here, we have to understand that we have a maximum real GDP that's there, okay? And that's called potential, and that's where the economy is at and will remain there until spending drops enough to kick us out of that classical segment. But that's going to take longer than a year. Our time frame is between 6 and 9 months. And so there's your summary information, and there's your answer to letter M. Now we're moving on to letter K. We are back in the Keynesian segment of aggregate supply. So real GDP sub 1, CPI sub R, those are our macro equilibrium. We're told the national income of Canada, Europe, Australia, and Latin America increases. Interesting thing, those are some countries that we trade with heavily. We export a lot to them and import a lot to them. And I said every nation is like a store, but every nation is also like a business. If the U.S. is a business, these countries are our customers. If I am a business and I've got some really good customers and they all say have an increase in their pay, they get a better job and get paid more money, I would expect they would spend more money at my business. And so if our trading partners have an increase in their national income, they're going to spend more of their money. But what do we call that money that is traded between foreign countries where goods and services are being shipped out and money's coming in and vice versa? Those are called exports and imports. So this is going to affect the net export spending. And more specifically, net export spending will do what? Well, if these countries have more of their own money to spend, they're going to buy more American goods. So net export spending increases. All righty. Spending only affects what curve? Aggregate demand. And when spending increases, AD shifts to the right. Excellent. 9 months means it does not leave that Keynesian segment. So let's copy this AD2 that I created for this particular use here. And then let's paste it in here and make sure we're still crossing that Keynesian segment. And somebody has to say, well, that looks like the same graph we had up there. It's similar, but it's not the same. What happened up there was we had an increase in gross private investment spending. Down here, instead, we're having an increase in the net export spending. And so let's get our directionality arrow in place here. We're going to show it shifting to the right. That needs to be blue. Okay. We need to locate, the new equilibrium real GDP, which is going to be here directly below that intersection point. And let's put our shifter arrow for the horizontal axis in there for good measure. Okay. And then let's label that sucker here, real GDP sub 2. And let's put it over there. Now, is there a change? I repeat, is there a change in CPI? A horizontal line has a fixed vertical height, so CPI does not change. And so CPI stays the same, just like we saw a little while ago. The real GDP is to the right of the old value, and so that means that real GDP increases. Okay, same result, but a different causality. In the first problem we worked, it was an increase in gross private investment spending. And in this example, we instead are having an increase in net export spending. Every market, or every, I should say, aggregate macro equilibrium gets its own scenario. So do not try to say, see the graph for this other part. That's not going to work. That's going to be frowned upon. You don't want to have that happen to you. Make sure you always construct each graph individually for every part. Doesn't matter if it's repetitious. Now, letter I says we have an increase in consumers' wealth. This means the accumulated assets that are held by American households, and more specifically, consumers' wealth is increasing. Consumers' wealth is going to affect how much households want or are able to spend. Now, if you suddenly found out you had a lot more money in your savings account, your house and your car were worth a lot more than you thought, would you feel more comfortable or less comfortable spending that paycheck? If you said more comfortable, you're a typical consumer, and that's correct. But here's the second thing I'm going to throw out to you here. Multiply this by over 150 million households, and then what? Yeah, we're going to see an increase in consumer spending. So consumer spending increases. And so AD shifts to the right. Shifts right is good enough. Okay. But this time we're not in the Keynesian segment. We are in the intermediate segment, which slopes upward. And so that's going to produce a different result. Now I'm grabbing that AD2 I had before, and here I can make a nice parallel shift that looks a lot better than I was doing earlier. Okay. The AD curve is shifting to the right, but notice it is still in the intermediate segment. We never leave the segment we start during the 9-month time frame. Let's put in some arrows, shall we? AD curve goes right. Okay. Let's locate our new macro equilibrium. The new real GDP2 will be on the horizontal axis. The CPI sub 2 will be on the vertical axis, and this time both of them are moving. Class, in some parts of the business cycle, you have either a production shock or a spending change, and nothing changes, okay? On the other hand, there are some parts of the business cycle where everything changes. And still other parts where you have one thing change, but not the other. And so we need to handle this carefully, students. And I'll get the doorbell later, okay? This is more important. Okay. After the AD curve is shifting to the right, can you see what's happened to the CPI? Don't worry, I'll put the CPI 2 there in a minute, okay? In fact, you know what? Let's put it there now, okay? CPI sub 2, real GDP sub 2. Let's put those in place, and then we'll finish solving that part. Again, I did not plan to do this video, but I'm trying to help you all out. I'm having to deal with some absences here, and so this is to help everybody out. All right. So those are now in place. We are good to go now. Okay. CPI 2 is vertically higher than CPI 1, so CPI increases. Real GDP sub 2 is to the right of real GDP sub 1, so real GDP also increases. So that is the end result of letter I, okay? Now, I got one more we're going to do here. And I want y'all to understand that you're not going to always see the AD curve shift to the right. I realize we had shift to the right a couple of times in this model, but it's also shifted to the left at least once. Similarly, you're not going to always see aggregate supply shift to the left. Sometimes it's going to shift to the right. It's just that it has, you know what, I'm going to modify this one because we need to do one where AS goes right, not just left here, okay? And so here we are. We're now in the classical segment again. Okay, CPI sub 1, real GDP sub F. Why don't I change that to say drop? The cost of water, seed, fertilizer, and labor is dropping in the agricultural industry. Now, agriculture is 2% of our GDP. That is a key industry. Last I checked, farms need seeds, farms need fertilizer, farms need water, farms need farm workers. So those are all resource costs for a key industry. So we're going to say key resource costs. Are they getting more expensive or less expensive with my change? Yes, they decrease. Now, resource costs are a production issue. This is not a spending issue. It's strictly production. Production costs are tied to aggregate supply. So will there be more or less production if it's cheaper to hire labor, cheaper to get seed and fertilizer and water? Well, farms have a budget. Their budget spends farther. They can buy more seed. They can buy more fertilizer. They can buy more water. They can hire more labor. Production is going to increase. So that means the AS curve shifts to the right. So now we need to deal with those mechanics. Okay. I'm going to do a couple of things here real quick because I need to emphasize something here. And that is that since we're in that classical segment, we're at that potential GDP. When that classical segment and that intermediate segment both shift right, you're going to have an increase in potential GDP. I didn't talk about it a couple of problems ago. I mean, technically there would be a decrease in potential GDP for F, but we weren't in the classical segment. We were in the intermediate segment. But it's relevant now that we're in the classical segment for this shifting. And so we're going to switch to blue. And the first thing you have to do is you have to lengthen that Keynesian segment to the right. You have to lengthen it to the right. Class, the Keynesian segment does not move up and down when the time frame is only about 9 months. That takes 20 years. This is macro short run. The Keynesian segment, which represents our bottom of our business cycle, is at a fixed vertical height for that CPI sub R, and we're not even in it anyway. So we got that one first. Now let's draw our connector here. It's approximately parallel, and again, I'm sorry it's not as neat as it could have been. Okay. And then we need to do our classical segment last, okay, which is vertical, and those should be about the same length. Do not change the length of this stuff. And also, please make sure, I repeat, please make sure that you do not make the intermediate segment too short. It should not be less than a third the total length. It should be exactly a third the total length. And so we've got an AS2 here, okay, in the place of the AS1 because we've got the curve shifting right. Again, when AS shifts to the right, The classical, which is the vertical segment, shifts right. And it's parallel. The intermediate segment, which is upper sloping piece, shifts right. But the Keynesian segment, the horizontal piece, gets longer. Okay. Now I need to locate my new macro equilibrium. I'm not going to use a solid line for this one. Actually I will. It's fine. We'll be consistent here. We need to locate that new equilibrium GDP, but it's also our new potential GDP. And I'm trying to make this line nice and straight. And sometimes the mouse doesn't want to cooperate. So please forgive me, students. I will get this done just so. Okay. All right. As the engineer says, close enough. Okay. Real GDP F2, not F1, F2. Let me get that subscript positioned nicely. There we go. And that goes directly below here. Okay. Shifter arrow. Notice we have an increase in potential GDP. We have an increase in the economy's production capacity. Now we got to locate our new equilibrium CPI. And that's off the new equilibrium. You notice the starting and the finishing macro equilibrium were both in the classical segment. Reason why? Between 6 and 9 months is why. Okay. Not long enough to kick out of that segment. This is first impact only. And so CPI sub 2 goes here. All right. I'm going to put in my last two shifter arrows. You always have one for the curve and then one for each axis. And this is interesting here. All righty. So taking a final look at this here, what's going on here? The CPI sub 2 is vertically lower than the CPI sub 1, so CPI decreases. The real GDP sub F2 is to the right of the real GDP sub F1, so real GDP increases. And it's not just any real GDP, it's potential, but you don't have to put that. It just means that this increase in our production capacity means we have a higher range we can improve. And when the CPI decreases, that's called deflation. All righty. So I modified the letter L here, but these are all of our solutions, okay? And so this thing here is none. But again, one thing I've also said in class is every one of these problems has 6 versions. Problem C, for example, I could have started intermediate. I could have started classical. I could have had the interest rate and commercial debt increase, which would have made AD shift to the left. Again, starting Keynesian, intermediate, or classical. That's where the other versions come from. For this one, I could have had this start in the classical or in the Keynesian segment. Okay, that produces a different result. And I could have had the cost of employing these medical personnel drop, which would have AS shift to the right, with the Keynesian segment getting longer, which would also produce a different result. Every one of these problems has 6 versions, and so it's a good idea to stretch your brain to think about the other 5. Start in the other 2 segments of aggregate supply, and then do all 3 segments for the opposite descriptor of what happens. But this is how you solve those problems. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen. We're going to wrap up. Again, I was not intending to do another video for this, mainly because of the fact that I want y'all to be in class. But because we've had some people who've had some emergencies who needed to be absent, I've done this one as a courtesy. And also because I was absent because I was sick today. And I wanted to make sure that everybody got some help here, especially if you were absent and couldn't come to the Tuesday, Thursday class. All righty. Have a good evening, and thank you all very much.